I need to tell you something I have never told anyone before. Not my parents, not my best friends, not even the person I thought I would spend the rest of my life with. This is the story of a connection that changed everything about who I thought I was, who I was afraid to become, and who I finally, after years of hiding and running and pretending, allowed myself to be. If you are watching this right now, I want you to know that what I am about to say took me 27 years to find the courage to speak out loud, so please, stay with me until the very end, because the ending is not what you think it is going to be. My name is Daniel. Or at least, that is what the world called me for most of my life. I grew up in a small town where everybody knew everybody, where the boys played football on Friday nights and the girls wore ribbons in their hair, and nobody ever questioned which side of that line you were supposed to stand on. I was the son of a construction worker and a school librarian. My father had hands like slabs of concrete and a laugh that could shake the walls. My mother was quiet and kind, the sort of woman who pressed flowers between the pages of books and hummed to herself when she thought no one was listening. They loved me. I never doubted that. But love, I would come to learn, can exist in the same space as a complete and total misunderstanding of who someone actually is. I think I was 7 years old the first time I felt it. The feeling I could not name. We were doing a school play, some kind of holiday production, and there was a costume box in the corner of the classroom that had been donated by a local theatre group. I remember the teacher letting us pick out pieces to try on, just for fun, nothing serious. And I reached into that box and pulled out a pair of silver ballet flats and a shimmering blue skirt with little stars sewn along the hem, and I held them in my hands, and something inside me went completely still. Like the whole world had gone quiet. Like something had clicked into place that I did not know was out of place to begin with. I put them back in the box before anyone could see. I laughed extra loud that afternoon and knocked over 2 chairs on purpose just to seem normal. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever noticed. That was the beginning. Growing up, I became very good at being what everyone needed me to be. I was loud when I needed to be loud, rough when roughness was expected, careless with things in the way that boys were supposed to be careless. I played sports badly but enthusiastically. I made jokes that I did not always understand. I had friends who taught me the language of a life I was supposed to want. And inside, quietly, in a place I locked so tightly I almost forgot it existed, there was this other version of me that never got to speak. Never got to breathe. Never got to exist anywhere except the darkest corners of my own mind at 3 in the morning when the rest of the house was asleep, and I would lie there staring at the ceiling wondering why I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I did not have a word for it then. The internet existed, but I was careful about what I looked at and who might see. I had stumbled across enough to know that what I felt had a shape, had a community, had a whole world of people who understood it, but knowing that and actually allowing yourself to enter that world are 2 very different things when you are 18 years old in a small town where the football coach is also your Sunday school teacher and your father's poker buddy. I went to college. Moved to a bigger city. Told myself that the distance from home would make things easier, and in some ways it did. In other ways it made everything harder because now there were no more excuses. No more small-town constraints I could hide behind. No more saying I simply had no opportunity to explore the questions that were eating me alive. Now I had every opportunity, and I still did not take any of them, because the fear had grown with me. Had graduated alongside me. Had moved into my apartment and slept in my bed and sat across from me in every class and said, "Do not do it, do not be seen, do not let anyone find out, do not become that." I was 23 when I met Ryan. He became my best friend in a way that I had never had a best friend before. We met in the architecture program, spent late nights over drawings and coffee, argued about design philosophy like it actually mattered, and laughed at everything and nothing. Ryan was easy to be around in a way that most people were not. He did not ask too many questions. He did not require me to perform a version of myself. He just let me exist in whatever shape I happened to take on a given day, and that simple, uncomplicated acceptance was more valuable to me than anything I had ever been given. But even Ryan did not know my secret. Even Ryan, who knew that I sometimes reread the same paragraph of a book 40 times when I was anxious, who knew that I cried at animated movies but pretended it was allergies, who knew that I had a drawer full of letters I had written to people and never sent, Even he did not know the thing that lived at the center of my life like a stone I had been carrying since I was 7 years old. And then came the connection. The one that changed everything. Her name was Priya. I met Priya at a gallery opening that Ryan dragged me to. She was standing in front of a painting that was mostly just different shades of grey, and she was laughing quietly to herself, and I asked her what was funny, and she turned to look at me and said, "I am laughing because this painting cost $40,000 and it looks exactly like my parking garage." I laughed so hard I spilled my drink. We talked for 4 hours. Ryan went home at some point and neither of us noticed. Priya was everything I was not. She was fearless in the way that only people who have already survived their worst fear can be. She was a fashion designer who made costumes for theatre productions on the side. She had a studio apartment that was wall-to-wall fabric and sketches and half-finished garments hanging from every surface. She was warm and generous and completely, absolutely herself, without apology, without performance. And within 3 months of meeting her, I was more afraid of her than I had been of anything in my life. Because Priya saw things. Not in a supernatural way, not in any way I could dismiss as mystical or exaggerated. She simply paid attention. She watched the way people moved and held themselves and flinched at certain words. She noticed when someone's laugh was real and when it was armor. And she was watching me, I could feel it, with this gentle, patient attention that made me want to simultaneously confess everything and run as fast as I could in the opposite direction. It happened on a Tuesday in November. I remember the month because the heating in her studio was broken and we had both put on extra layers and were drinking tea that was too hot and complaining about it anyway. She was working on a costume for a production of a Shakespeare play, something elaborate and historical, and she was muttering to herself about proportions, and I was sitting on her old velvet couch watching her work and feeling the warmth of being close to someone who made the world feel a little less impossible. She held up a velvet gown. Deep burgundy, with a lace collar and buttons down the front that looked like tiny pearls. She turned it in the light, frowning at the way it moved, then looked at me with that particular look she had that meant she was about to say something that was going to rearrange something inside me. She said, "Try it on for me." I said, "What?" She said, "The proportions are wrong and I need to see it on someone. You are roughly the size of the character. Come on." I said no. I said it too fast and too loud, and the silence that followed said everything I was not saying. Priya lowered the gown slowly. She looked at me for a long moment, not with pity, not with judgment, just with that attention of hers, steady and clear, and then she said something that I have turned over in my mind every single day since that moment. She said, "You know you are allowed to want things, right?" And I do not know what happened to me in the space between hearing those words and what came next. Something cracked. Not broke, not shattered, cracked, the way ice cracks in spring before it finally lets the water move. I felt my face do something I could not control and I looked away from her very quickly and pretended to be very interested in a bolt of fabric on the table beside me, and she did not push. She did not say another word. She just kept working, and I sat there on her velvet couch feeling like I was made of very thin glass, and eventually the moment passed, but nothing was the same after it. I went home that night and I could not sleep. I lay in my bed with all the lights off and the stone I had been carrying since I was 7 years old felt suddenly very heavy, heavier than it had ever felt, and I thought about 7-year-old me reaching into a box of costumes and finding something that made the whole world go quiet, and I thought about 23-year-old me standing in Priya's studio and saying no too loud and too fast, and I thought about all the years between those two moments and what they had cost me. I started asking myself a question I had never been brave enough to ask before. Not what is wrong with me, which was the question I had been asking for 20 years, but what do I actually want? What do I actually feel? What would it look like if I stopped running from the thing that has been chasing me my entire life? I did not have the answer immediately. It took weeks. It took long walks at night and a lot of uncomfortable conversations with myself and several attempts at journaling that I deleted immediately after writing because even the page felt too exposed. But slowly, the answer took shape. And the shape of it was not frightening in the way I had expected. It was not the monster I had built it into. It was something much simpler and much more tender than that. It was just me. A different version of me that I had been keeping in a locked room for 2.5 decades. A version that wanted to exist. I went back to Priya's studio on a Saturday afternoon when she had told me she would be there alone. I knocked on her door. She opened it and looked at me and said nothing, just stepped aside to let me in, and I walked into that studio full of fabric and light and half-finished dreams, and I stood in the middle of the room and I said, I want to try it on. The gown. If the offer is still there. She looked at me for a moment and then she smiled. Not the big bright smile she used for gallery openings and dinner parties. A smaller, quieter one. She said, the offer is always there. What happened next was not dramatic in the way I had always imagined it would be if this moment ever came. There was no music. There was no lightning bolt. Priya helped me into the gown, made adjustments with practiced hands, and then turned me gently to face the long mirror she kept against the far wall. And I stood there looking at myself, and something in my chest unlocked so suddenly it actually hurt, like a muscle that had been clenched for so long that releasing it was its own kind of pain. I looked like myself. For the first time in my memory, I looked like myself. I did not cry immediately. I held it together for about 30 seconds and then I did not hold it together at all. Priya handed me a box of tissues without comment and sat down on the velvet couch and waited while I stood there in a burgundy velvet gown with a lace collar and sobbed like I had not sobbed since I was a child. She did not try to fix it or explain it or minimize it. She just let me feel it, fully, which was the greatest kindness anyone had ever shown me. When I finally stopped, she said, "How long have you been carrying that?" I said, "Since I was 7. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That is a very long time to carry something alone." And that was it. That was the beginning of everything. Priya became my guide through a world I had been circling from the outside my entire life. She was not pushy or prescriptive. She did not tell me what I was or what category I fit into or what my feelings meant in any definitive sense. She simply created a space where I could explore without judgment, and in that space I began to understand things about myself that I had been actively running from for 20 years. We started slowly. She would work on costume pieces and invite me to try things on when we were alone in the studio. A skirt here, a blouse there, sometimes a full outfit. She taught me things, practical things, about proportion and silhouette and how clothes relate to the body, and somewhere in those lessons was a deeper kind of teaching, about how you can inhabit yourself differently when you stop fighting against what is true. I started to build my own small collection. Nothing dramatic, nothing expensive. A couple of things I ordered online and tracked nervously and hid in the back of my closet. The first time I put on something of my own in my own apartment with no audience, just me and the mirror, I felt a terror and an exhilaration so finely balanced that I could not tell them apart. I stood there in my bedroom at 11 o'clock at night with the blinds down and I thought, this is real. This is actually real. And then I thought, what do I do with real? I told Ryan first. I had to. He was my best friend and keeping this from him felt like a lie I was telling every time we were together, and I could not do it anymore. I called him and asked if I could come over, and he said of course, and when I got there I sat on his couch and stared at my hands for about 4 minutes while he waited with the patience of someone who has absolutely no idea what is coming but is willing to receive it anyway. I told him about being 7. I told him about the ballet flats and the starry skirt and the moment in the costume box when everything had gone quiet. I told him about 20 years of carrying it. I told him about Priya's studio and the burgundy gown and the crying and the box of tissues. I told him that I had started exploring, privately, carefully, that I had not figured out what any of it meant in terms of labels or identity, but that it was real and it was mine and I was done pretending otherwise. When I finished talking, the silence stretched out long enough that I started to feel the fear returning. And then Ryan said, "Okay." And then he said, "Thank you for telling me." And then he said, "Are you hungry?" Because I was about to make pasta. That was it. That was all. I want to tell you that in that moment I felt a relief so total and so physical that it felt like putting down something I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten it was there, because that is exactly what it felt like, and nothing I say is sufficient to describe it. Not everyone was Ryan, though. I need to be honest about that because I do not want this to be the kind of story that tells you it all goes smoothly once you start being honest, because it does not always. There was a friend from college, someone I had known for years, who I told one afternoon over coffee, and his response was a long silence followed by a lot of questions that felt more like challenges, and after that afternoon things between us were never quite the same. He was not cruel. He was not angry. He was just confused in a way that somehow felt worse, because I could feel him reordering everything he thought he knew about me and coming up with an image he was not sure he recognized anymore. I also told my younger sister, eventually. That conversation is the one that I replay most often. She is 4 years younger than me, and we have always been close in that particular way that siblings can be close, which is to say, deeply familiar with each other but also capable of inflicting the most precise kind of pain. She sat very still while I talked, and when I finished she said, "I knew something was wrong." I said, "Nothing is wrong." She said, I knew something was there. I knew you were keeping something." She said, "I'm glad you told me." And then she said, "I need some time to process this," which was the most honest and the most respectful thing she could have said, and I loved her for it. My parents. That is the chapter one I'm still in the middle of, if I am being truthful. My mother, who pressed flowers between pages and hummed to herself, took the news with more grace than I expected. She cried, not out of shame, I believe, but out of something more complex, the grief of realizing your child carried something alone for a very long time that they could not bring to you. She held my hands and said she was sorry I had not felt safe to tell her sooner, and that was the thing that broke me open all over again, that she apologized to me. My father is harder. He has not said anything unkind. He has also not said much of anything at all. We are in a waiting place, the two of us, standing on opposite sides of a bridge that neither of us quite knows how to cross. I choose to believe we will cross it. I have to believe that. What I want to tell you, if you have made it this far, is not that this story has a clean ending, because it does not, because I am still living it. What I want to tell you is what transformation actually feels like from the inside, because I think people imagine it as a single moment, a reveal, a before and after. And some parts of it are like that. There are moments that are genuinely before and genuinely after. But mostly it is slower than that. It is 1,000 small moments of choosing to be honest when dishonesty would be safer. It is standing in front of a mirror and learning to see the person looking back at you as a person who deserves to exist. It is a burgundy gown and a box of tissues and a friend on a velvet couch who does not ask you to explain yourself, just lets you feel what you feel. It is a best friend saying, "Okay, are you hungry?" It is a sister saying, "I need some time to process this," and meaning it as love. It is a mother's apology. It is a father's silence that is not yet closed. I started creating content about my experience, not because I wanted attention or approval, but because I spent 20 years searching for a voice that sounded like mine in this particular kind of darkness, and I never found it, and I thought that maybe someone else was in the same place I had been, looking for something that might make them feel less alone. That is why I am telling you this story. Not as a lesson. Not as a guide. Just as the truth of one person who spent a very long time being afraid and is now, slowly, carefully, imperfectly, learning what it feels like to stop. The person I am now and the person I was at 7 years old have more in common than I realized for a long time. We both reached into a box and found something that made everything go quiet. The difference is that the person I am now is learning to hold on to it instead of putting it back. Priya and I had tea last week in her studio, which finally has working heat. She was working on a new piece, a gown for a production of a contemporary play, deep green velvet with gold thread along the hem. She held it up and looked at it critically for a long time, and then she looked at me, and in that look was everything: the Tuesday in November, the burgundy gown, the box of tissues, 2 years of slow and difficult and beautiful becoming, and she said, "It is going to be something when it is finished." I looked at the gown, unfinished, mid-becoming, all its potential still in front of it, and I said, "Yes. I think it is. I believe that about myself too. I am mid-becoming. I am still in the middle of the story I started at 7 years old in a classroom with a costume box in the corner. But I am not hiding anymore. I am not putting things back and laughing too loud and pretending. I am here, in the room, holding on to what makes the world go quiet for me, and for the first time in my life, I am not afraid of how that looks. If you are somewhere I used to be, if you are carrying something that feels impossible to put down and equally impossible to keep holding, I want you to know that the weight is real, but it is not permanent. The connection that transformed me completely was not just with Priya, though she was the beginning. It was a connection with myself. With the 7-year-old who reached into a box and felt something true. With the version of me that had been waiting, patient and persistent, through all those years of noise and performance and fear, to finally be seen. You do not have to become everything overnight. You do not have to have the words or the category or the answer. You just have to let yourself want what you want. You are allowed to want things. Someone told me that once in a studio full of fabric and light, and I have been trying to live up to it ever since. That is the whole story. Or at least, it is everything up to right now, which is the only kind of whole any of us can ever really offer. I am Daniel, and I am Danny, and I am the 7-year-old in the costume box and the 27-year-old in the burgundy gown and the person currently sitting in front of this camera with cold tea and shaking hands and a heart that has never felt so full of something I actually want to keep. Thank you for staying until the end. It meant everything.